You're very good. Welcome to the Wednesday edition of the show. If you'd like to give us a call, 1890 453 106 is our low call number. Our text number is 53106. It will cost you 30 cents. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or send us an email to afternoon@newstalk.ie. And if anyone listening would like to send us in any free ice cream, Claire Sutton, particularly of this programme, would be more than welcoming of any gifts you might have to throw our way. Our guest in the studio, I'm pleased to say, is Frank McNally, columnist with the Irish Times. Frank, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Sean.
Isn't it a lovely day?
It is a gorgeous day. I cycled in as I always do from Kilmainham, and I had a jacket on to the last moment, and I stepped outside and I thought, I don't need this jacket, and I tore it off and threw it away with a sense of abandon.
That's quite exciting. Annie West would be really excited thinking about you ripping off your jacket in that manly way.
Hello,
Is it safe to cycle around Dublin?
No, this is a discussion I've had with that psycho car driver, George Hook, a number of times in this programme. George goes around targeting rogue cyclists in his car. And no, it's not safe. Well, I mean, I've been doing it for years, and touch wood, I haven't had an accident, but I have fallen off the bike twice in the last 12 months.
Right.
I felt quite well, which must be down to the Pilates classes.
Probably training,
I came out the side of the bike on both occasions, and on one occasion I took the entire weight of my body with my left hand, which was slightly dislocated for a couple of days afterwards, but it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, because I used to cycle in Dublin, and it was just striking how invisible you suddenly become if you're on a bike, and people will open doors in front of you and pull out in front of you, and you're just not there at all.
Opening doors, that is that is a thing to chill the blood when you're a cyclist. That thing, the suddenly open door. I remember when I first cycled in Dublin, going back to the 1980s now, when life was cheap, especially mine. I didn't worry about it that much, and maybe there wasn't that much traffic around. And then I stopped. I bought a car belatedly and got a bit lazy for maybe about 10 years, and then I went back to it. You know, at the height of the raging Celtic Tiger, when there were like more cars than ever on the road, and there were big cars and fast cars, and everybody was in a hurry, and didn't have time to drive around cyclists. And my God, it seemed for the first few weeks and months when I went back out on the road, it seemed an awful lot more dangerous. Part of that was probably me getting old and having children.
Intimations of mortality and all that,
but it did seem much more dangerous. Somehow I've got used to it again. But there are certain places I would avoid still where at all possible, like the Quays. I mean, the Quays are a horror story, you know. But
having said that, now in fairness, sometimes I was nearly run over the other day by a cyclist. Who didn't seem to think that the red light applied to them. They don't do themselves favours sometimes. Yeah,
that is a common problem. Obviously, you and I always stop at red lights, but I have heard of many cyclists who don't. In fact, there was a sad case in England there recently. It's a court case. It happened. The actual event happened 2 years ago, where a guy with a ridiculously expensive mountain bike, £5,000 worth of mountain bike, was cycling down a footpath, presumably at 50 miles an hour or something, and knocked somebody over, and it was a woman, and she died. And some people were calling for a new law to specifically ban dangerous cycling. But I mean, it was a tragic case, and obviously this guy, I couldn't see any defence for what he did, but that was one death caused by cycling. And as I point out to your colleague, Mr. Hook, regularly, you set that against the countless thousands.
Yes, indeed.
Caused by other vehicles, and our record isn't that bad. I mean, we're not really that dangerous, I would suggest.
Somebody just texted in to say, people on bikes are invisible because the rules of the roads are invisible to them. So good enough if they get knocked down.
See, a point I make there, half seriously, and sometimes when a caller like that gets my blood up, more than half seriously, is that the rules of the road, in my opinion, I speak as a driver and a cyclist, and indeed a pedestrian, so an occasional public transport user, I've got all bases covered, unlike George, another point I use against him. The rules of the road were not made for cyclists. The rules of the road were made by and large by and for car users. And things like, for instance, the one-way system, which is widely disregarded by cyclists. The one-way system is not there to regulate bike traffic or indeed pedestrian traffic. It's there to solve a problem that's caused by cars. And there are parts of Dublin, like central Dublin, where to get from point A to point B on your bike, you would legally be required to say, cycle a mile
out of your way,
into the wind and the rain, and into the way of psycho drivers to get there. So people tend to take shortcuts, and by and large I think it's probably justified, because in civilized countries, in civilized cities like Amsterdam, I believe cyclists have right of way in all circumstances. That's just the rule, because cyclists are good. Not drivers per se are bad, but driving and cars in city centres are generally regarded as a thing to be discouraged, and vice versa with bikes.
Actually, somebody on Twitter says, I stopped cycling because of the potholes. Why can't they repair the roads in Dublin without needing contractors to do so? Would the state of the roads bad for potholes? I suppose you notice them more if you're on a bike.
And speed bumps out where I live. There's some vicious speed bumps, that if you hit them the wrong angle, as I've occasionally done. I've been coming home from time to time with a bag of shopping on the carrier, and my half a dozen eggs will hop out of the bag and smash on the road. This has happened to me at least twice, because you hit a speed bump at the wrong angle.
That can be. You could end up being impaled on your own bicycle. In very unfortunate way.
You certainly could.
You did mention, of course, the height of the Celtic Tiger when cyclists were just seen as fair game.
Yes.
The Nyberg report doesn't make any reference to that, but it's a bit sort of, y'all went a bit mad.
Yeah.
Thanks, we knew that.
Yes. Yeah, I do wonder at the value of these things. I mean, it does seem to. The Irish Times editorial today says that it's surprisingly light on figures and rather heavy on psychology.
Yes.
Something that endeavours to explain the collapse of the banking system. I think essentially the big finding is that we lost the run of ourselves, and I think this was something that was probably apparent even to ourselves as far back as 2005.
In fairness, though, to Nyberg, it would seem to be the case that with the question everybody wanted answered was what happened on the night of the bank guarantee, what was the sequence of events, what was said, who gave advice, etc. And there are no records of that night, surprisingly.
Incredibly, because there are nobody was keeping minutes. No doubt it was because of the stress that nobody thought to get out a notebook and take a few notes of what was happening. Yeah, that is one of the, rather, as the Independent says today, that is at one point of the report that stretches credibility to breaking point and beyond.
Well, and then of course this was a report that was commissioned by the previous government, and quelle surprise, they can't lay a glove on them. So forgive me for being completely cynical, but this is just a waste of money then.
Yeah, it's so it seems. I mean, it does confirm certain prejudices that some of us might have had about so-called banking experts. There's a line in it here about how he's talking about the herd mentality that overtook not just people, not just ordinary people buying property, but people in banks. Some of the participants in a herd have only a partial idea of the economic advantages and disadvantages of a particular course of action, for instance, investing in property lending. However, they assume others have a clearer view and follow them. And he's talking about the bankers themselves. These are the people who are supposed to know where they're leading us. Colin McCarthy has a funny line, not in this, but he has spoken of the epiphany he had when he saw the then bank regulator. Not just he, but the nation had, when the bank regulator went on prime time or one of those programs to try and calm the nation. People saw him for the first time, and it was a lot of people saw him for the first time, and it was like that moment at the end of World War II when the Japanese emperor had to go on radio for the first time, and Japanese people had assumed him to be a god until that moment, and they'd never heard his voice before, and it was kind of a little reedy voice, and not very it was a similarly shattering moment for according to Colin McCarthy, when I didn't actually see that broadcast, when the man whom we assumed was in control had his finger on the pulse of things, went on television and looked very human.
But it would say, I mean, Nyberg, I suppose, is describing a kind of almost a circle of stupidity where everybody reinforced everybody's ideas, that being the things that they wanted to believe.
Yeah.
And in that regard, I mean, we were all in the herd then, because we were all being told.
Yeah, again, and maybe that's the other discomforting thing. It is quite comfortable these days for us all to throw stones at certain bankers, especially we hear a news story like yesterday, your man's payoff deal from the AIB, but Nyberg is pointing the finger rather generally at us all and saying, there were very few people untouched, but he blames the media too. Do you
think that's a fair point?
It probably is a fair point. The there was undoubtedly a potential conflict of interest, because for all those years of the Celtic Tiger, newspapers, and some newspapers more than others, made fortunes out of not just recruitment advertising, but famously out of property advertising. Those, you used to, if you had a job in newspapers, you looked at the, you felt the thickness of the job supplement on the Friday, or the property supplement on the Thursday, and you thought, oh my job is safe. You just counted those ads and you thought, the future is bright. And there was a potential conflict of interest, but I would say, in defence of my own newspaper, I believe we were the first paper to give the prophet of doom himself, the prophet in the wilderness, perhaps a better phrase from Morgan Kelly, a platform to say this is all going to end badly. And I think
when did you write that first article? It was it frightened the pants off you, and it all pretty much came true.
It was in 2007.
Was it 2007?
I think it was 2007. And he wrote he wrote an initial article, and then I think he wrote a follow-up some months later, which he offered around to other newspapers. I don't think there were that many enthusiastic takers, and I think that too ended up in the Irish Times. So I'm only pinning that one to the mast there.
Because that was when he put it in very simple: imagine you make so much a week, and this is how much you're going to have to pay back.
See, unfortunately, there were so many voices on the other side. My own former, a guy who went to the same school as me a few years afterwards, Richard Curran of the Sunday Business Post and of the what do you call that, Dragon's Den programme, people will know. He made a famous documentary, an incredibly well-timed documentary in, I think it was April 2007, probably the height of the boom, where the prices peaked and began to tail off. And it was called, wasn't it? The series was called Future Shock, but it's somewhere in the tagline was a property crash. And I believe, that when they went looking for various respectable people to talk on this, the mere mention of the word crash, the fact that the word crash was going to appear anywhere, sent some people running for cover. And it was he took a lot of flack at the time for saying the unmentionable. I brought in my copy, by the way, of a small book that everybody should read. J.K. Galbraith, famous economist, he wrote the definitive history of the Great Crash in 1929. And whatever Professor Nyborg thinks he says this was a uniquely Irish problem. There are an awful lot of echoes in this book of the general, market mania that afflicted people. And he has a lovely phrase in it where the phrase preventive incantation, which is it's a psychological thing where you get to a certain point in any boom and people start to worry that it may go wrong. And then he says preventive incantation required that as many important people as possible repeat as firmly as they could that it wouldn't happen. And things like, little phrases like it will be a soft landing, or it's different this time, or the fundamentals are sound, things like that. The equivalent of that was being said in 1929 up until the last moment.
It's and it is astounding how fragile the whole thing is, and it's really people are either in a herd sense, they're either being greedy or they're being terrified, and it's one or the other.
Sure. Another little quote from this book that I like. Galbraith was very hard on academics, funny enough. He said, like, academics, they were the cheerleaders back in the 1920s, the business academics. And he quotes a man. You talk about one of the usual defences of markets is that the wisdom of crowds, that the more people you have in a market, the more views are represented, the more knowledge is represented, and the crowd as a whole will get it right. And this, contradicts it absolutely. This is a Professor Lawrence of Princeton University who said, this is in, I think, about 2 months before the crash. He said, the consensus of judgment of the millions whose valuations function on that admirable market, the stock exchange, is that stocks are not at present overvalued. He added, where is that group of men with the all-embracing wisdom which will entitle them to veto the judgment of this intelligent multitude, And again, the same thing was being said about the few doomed prophets back in by certain people, including the then Taoiseach, who suggested they should go off and commit suicide.
Indeed. He's now lending his wisdom to Nigeria. God help them. We have to take a commercial break. Back in a minute. 53106 is our text number that will cost you 30 cents, or you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Frank McNally from the Irish Times is still with us. We have been talking about the Nyborg report, such as it was, and cycling, which seems to exercise a lot of people. Sean in Wexford on the first subject says, during the boom, the media and the Irish Times in particular were cheerleaders to keep the party going. They are still cheerleading, but now leading the lynch mob for scapegoats. says Sean in Wexford. S in Wicklow says, Sean, I'm an idiot, but I have a really menial job because I'm too stupid for anything else. But I've been listening to this economy thing since before September 2008, and the one person who seems to have got it right most often is David McWilliams, yet no one in power has listened to him. Why? Says S in Wicklow. Well, that's a very good question. I found an old newspaper property section from 1999 in work, and it was warning about an overheating property market. That was in 1999. But of course, nobody was listening at that point. It's a funny thing, all right, that you'd think that our government would go and now I know that at some point Brian Lenihan did call into David McWilliams' house in the middle of the night and he had
chewing garlic,
weirdly enough, but no one seems to have consulted with the people who got it right since, as far as anyone knows. You think they would? Since the new government came into power, at least.
Yeah, I suppose they're all so much in the media, the ones who got it right, and even the ones who are getting it retrospectively right,
yes.
They're on the media so much now because they are the stars, they are the media stars of our time, that maybe politicians feel they don't need to consult them in person. They just need to watch the Vincent Brown show and,
pretty much, yeah.
Various newspapers.
Sometimes I think they're actually having a competition to see who can come out with the most doom-laden scenario. I went for Brian Lucy and Constant Gurdjieff to turn up in combat jackets, and guns, ready to hunt for things.
It's a competitive market out there. The Loom market is very competitive.
It is, yes. It's very competitive.
And maybe there is a herd instinct as well.
On the subject of cycling, Texas says, I was in Hamburg recently, and cycling on the footpaths is the norm. Everyone is very safe, and pedestrian and bikes mingle nicely. Tom says, what's with all the negativity on this beautiful day? The bike scheme is a terrific asset to our beautiful city. It is, Tom. We never mentioned it. We were just talking about cycling in general. Alan says, age 40, went back to cycling last year for commuting. I haven't regretted it and have the mileage I used to do in my car. P.S. I stop for red lights. Good for you, Alan. And another texter says, I live in Donnybrook, and the amount of bikes going up and down Moorhampton Road in winter at rush hour without any lights whatsoever is beyond my comprehension. And they never stop at pedestrian crossings. I was almost ploughed down by a cyclist too arrogant to stop. That's you, Frank.
There are some arrogant cyclists out there, again, excluding us. That's a good point about footpaths. There are certain footpaths in Dublin, not all of them obviously, but there are certain footpaths that are extravagantly wide, for the needs of pedestrians alone. And I'm thinking of St. Stephen's Green. It's these lovely, wide, like almost dual carriageway footpaths all the way around. And I wouldn't see anything wrong with a cyclist making his or her way along at a reasonable pace, 5 or 10 miles an hour, no threat to any pedestrian, and it's a hell of a lot safer for the cyclist than being out on the road.
There is an argument for that. Now, this might horrify people who are of the cyclists or arrogant school of thought, but we have interviewed people on the show who that have been experimental schemes in London, and I think in Holland as well, where this is for motorists now, but they got rid of all the stop signs, any signs whatsoever, and what that does is that forces the motorist to pay attention to what's going on. There's no pedestrian crossings, people can cross wherever they want. It slows things down, but they're looking around, they're aware, and there's fewer accidents.
I know all about this. I've written about this. It's called the Naked Streets Movement, and it started in Holland, although it's not what you would think.
Yes. well, not what you'd hope.
Something that started in Holland, and it's called the Naked Streets Movement. It was a man, he died last year, or maybe the year before, a Dutch road engineer who pioneered it in Holland. And, the caveat is things that work in Holland where people are law-abiding, except apparently in the area of drugs. It might not work here. There might be an anarchic element here which you would not have in certain. And they also tried it in mid-size.
They did it in High Street, Kensington, in London.
Did they? Right.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, in Holland, I remember the classic experiment was a town. I can't recall the name of it now, but it was a mid-sized town, something like maybe, I don't know, Dundalk, or maybe even smaller than that. Dundalk took away everything, took away all the street furniture, all the road markings, even things like, the traffic calming things that aren't signs or barriers, but the way they can design roads to suggest they bring out the footpaths just to pinch the road slightly.
Yes.
There's still room for a driver to go through, but the driver psychologically thinks I need to slow down or that curb. Things like that. They took away all of this and it reduced accidents because, as that was the argument, that they made it more dangerous. It was counterintuitive. They made it more dangerous, and in a way, they were using pedestrians as hostages to fortune.
Yes, in a way,
which would be, it would make it controversial in this part of the world.
I wonder, do they have signs saying this piece of road now is really dangerous? They probably couldn't do that if they go with their own
logic. The whole thing relied on drivers, because drivers. The idea is by corralling drivers, having those, big barriers running alongside junctions where pedestrians are completely separated from the road. That only encourages drivers to think, I can't run anybody over. I'm going to belt through that orange light. There's no risk involved. They make it dangerous, and drivers automatically, human instinct, slow down and start looking around them. And I remember one of the points he made was that this road engineer, he had a name like Mondrian, like the artist, but anyway, it escapes me. He said that it forced drivers themselves to make eye contact with each other, which is something that drivers tend to avoid doing. It's almost it's an aggressive thing. You do not want to look other drivers in the eye.
That's interesting. What it does is it forces people out of a herd mentality. So we've come to the end of where we started. Frank,
it was Professor Nyberg.
Frank, he was, yes. The guy from Futurama. Frank, thanks very much for coming into us today. Frank McNally there from the Irish Times. We'll be back with the news.